where he was considered one of the top 2 or 3 receivers in the league by the All-Pro team. Larry Fitzgerald just didn't have that peak.
Really excited to welcome in Aaron Schatz from ESPN, who was part of the all quarter century NFL team rankings on the site that came out this week. Aaron, how are you today?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I love talking about this historical stuff.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, and it always brings up a lot of debate. There's no doubt in that. But I want to start with the methodology, because I think sometimes people overlook that portion of these kind of things and just look at the list and get angry without understanding how it came together. Can you kind of walk us through how these rankings came about and kind of the methodology you guys used to come up with it?
There was a lot of balance. We had to balance the opinions of Seth Walder with my opinions. We had to balance a player's peak with his career. And we had to balance our advanced stats, which we used for a lot of positions, with sort of how these players were perceived at the time based primarily on the number of all pros and Pro Bowls that they were elected to. So we wanted to balance, like we didn't strictly use the advanced stats. We wanted to balance them with sort of all pros and how the media viewed people in 2002 or last year, right? And you don't think you've forgotten what happened 23, 24 years ago, but you kind of have. So, it mattered like who made all pro in 2002.
Yeah, I find it interesting. How much did longevity of career play in? I assume that it was a small factor that you kind of had to figure out because you talked about peak of career, but how much did that play into this as well?
It balanced. I mean, it was a balance. Okay, so for example, Julius Peppers is on the team because of his career numbers, right? We had to figure out a way to balance peak and career. And when it came to the edge rushers, we had guys who were peak guys like Myles Garrett and TJ Watt, who made our practice squad. And we had Peppers, who had the most sacks of anybody since the year 2000, but it was spread over a much longer career, right? So we tried to balance by getting both types of players on the team.
Did you take the teams that they played on into consideration, or was this solely individual?
Yeah, there was a little bit of that. For example, we felt like people would be shocked that we did Justin Jefferson after only 5 years. But Justin Jefferson hasn't played with great quarterbacks. So what he's been able to do in 5 years with lesser quarterbacks, we thought was pretty phenomenal. And I have a feeling I know where that's going to bring you.
Well, let's get into it. We can talk about a few of the Cardinals that made the list after this. But the big thing here in Arizona is obviously the omission of Larry Fitzgerald on this list. And you talk about quarterback play coming into account with Justin Jefferson. Larry Fitzgerald played with 16, caught passes from 16 different quarterbacks, 14 of which barely justified being NFL quarterbacks.
It's surprising what a high percentage of Larry Fitzgerald's career was spent with Kurt Warner and Carson Palmer. More than you think. Yeah, there were a lot of bad quarterbacks, but most of them were for like 4 games of Max Hall. Right? Like when we had a very hard time with the receivers. We had, I would say we had 12 receivers. If you include Jamar Chase, who's probably the first guy that we moved on from because it's only 4 years, I would say we had a dozen receivers that we were considering. And we looked at we went and looked at like who Larry Fitzgerald played with. And it's not as bad as you think. There's more years of Carson Palmer and Kurt Warner in there than you realize. And the thing about Larry Fitzgerald is that he had such a great long career. But in the advanced stats, for example, in my DYAR stat that takes every target into account, right? Defense adjusted yards above replacement. If you look at all the receivers we were considering except Jamar Chase, he's 11th if you add together his top 5 seasons, he only had 2 years in his career where he ranked in the top 5, and only 1 year where he was chosen first team All Pro. So he has the length of his career, but we decided that it's a hard decision to make, but we decided that he just had to come behind a couple of other guys who had who had long careers but better peaks. And he sort of was the next guy off, right? We had 6 receivers and 2 on the practice squad, and Fitzgerald was sort of the next guy that we didn't choose.
So I understand that, but what I struggle with is you look at where he ranks: second all time in yards and receptions, 6th all time in receiving touchdowns, 13th all time in touchdowns, 11-time Pro Bowler, had one of the best runs in terms of a playoff run in receiving history, right?
Right. But if you look at the other guys, you have Terrell Owens was a 5-time first team All Pro, Randy Moss 3, Harrison 2, Antonio Brown 4, Calvin Johnson 3, Justin Jefferson 2, Andre Johnson 2. I don't have Julio written down here for some reason, but Julio was a couple of times where he was considered one of the top 2 or 3 receivers in the league by the All Pro team. Larry Fitzgerald just didn't have that peak. It was hard to leave guys off.
Yeah.
We had to leave Mike Evans off too, who's had a phenomenal career. And we had to bump Andre Johnson and Antonio Brown to the practice squad. But we ended up, he just didn't have the peak that matched some of these other receivers.
Do you think, to me, I kind of wonder if those All Pro nods are in part because he played for the Cardinals, and a lot of those years there's an
very argument
bad.
to be made. Yeah, there's an argument. I mean, that's an argument. Was the press biased or not picking guys from teams that weren't as good? But again, he did have periods, the Warner period and the Palmer period, where that was a really good team that everybody, I think, was very aware of. In fact, we recognized other players from those teams. We just didn't have room for Fitzgerald.
Yeah, I think I understand the peaks with Kurt and Carson, and I understand that that's a larger percentage than most of us, especially in the desert, think, because you suffered through the John Skeltons of the world. You had a guy who wound up being a better tight end in the league, in Logan Thomas, play a game with Larry Fitzgerald at quarterback as well. So I think those peaks are high, that those valleys are low.
It's a sort of interesting argument because we have the same argument in favor of a Cardinals player at a different position, which is that we went with Patrick Peterson as our 5th cornerback and bumped Charles Woodson to the practice squad because Woodson is like Fitzgerald. The difference between Woodson and Fitzgerald is that Woodson had 2 awesome seasons that we didn't consider because they were in the 90s. Gotcha. And we were only doing since 2000, and Fitzgerald doesn't have that. But Woodson has the long career without the peak. His best peak years are like the first 2, which are in the 90s. And so we ended up going with Peterson, who had a better peak, and knocked Woodson to our practice squad.
Right. I think that's a worthy pick. I was kind of surprised. 2 other Cardinals on the list. J.J. Watt makes sense, and especially for what he did in his Houston time. Calais Campbell, I think, surprised me a little bit on the list because I don't think he's a guy. I mean, everybody remembers him fondly here, and he's had success, but I don't think when you think Calais Campbell, you think all quarter century team. I think that one surprised me a little bit, to be honest.
Yeah, that's more of a career one, I think. But he just kept going. He just just year after year after year after year. And in advanced stats, we used a stat called EPA, defensive EPA. And what that measures is the expected points added on a play where that defensive player is mentioned in the play-by-play, right? A tackle, an assist, a pass defensed, a turnover, obviously. And Calais Campbell comes out phenomenally in that stat. Not as good as like Watt or Donald or Ray Lewis, but very, very good. And so we felt that that kind of success over that whole career put him ahead of like Kevin Williams, who had a really nice peak, or Warren Sapp, who had a couple of really good years in the 90s that we didn't consider. It was that, again, defensive tackle. We had a number of guys that we considered. Plus, we wanted to make sure to have one spot on our team for a nose tackle who didn't get big pass rushing numbers, because not every tackle is a pass rusher, and you need to have somebody to stop the run. And we wanted to have a space that ended up being Vince Wilfork.
Yeah. Makes sense. Last one for you, and we can wrap it up here. But how tough is it to balance the analytical and the eye test? Because I think this is, over the last quarter century, I think this has been one of the bigger debates in sports. So when you're doing a list like this, how tough is it to balance that? How do you make sure that you feel that it's weighted in a way that you can justify everything?
Well, Seth Walder and I are analytics guys. That's what we are, right?
Yeah.
I've been doing analytics on the NFL for over 20 years. So obviously we were going to lean in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
I think what we wanted to do was not pick guys for whom it was just about the analytics, but we did have a couple of guys where the analytics are just so phenomenal that we didn't want to pass them up, even though they're controversial. And I would say the two guys that fit that bill are Priest Holmes and Levante David. Right? There was a lot. That's what I'm being called names on social media. When people are calling me names, they're calling me names about our running back choices, where we went with Priest Holmes, Christian McCaffrey, and Derrick Henry, and left LaDainian Tomlinson. And I thought Adrian Peterson on our practice squad, but I guess Adrian Peterson ended up being the 17th guy on a 16-guy practice squad, so he fell off. I know the great seasons that those players had. I absolutely, I think I argued for Tomlinson, actually, and then Seth convinced me that we wanted to go with Henry in the third position. But Priest Holmes, by my DYAR stat, if you include both receiving and rushing, had two of the three best seasons of the last 45 years by a running back. The other one being a Marshall Faulk season. Like, he was so good in 2002 and 2003. And people are like, oh, this guy had 28 touchdowns and this guy had 29 touchdowns. And Priest Holmes had 27 touchdowns in 2003. Like, don't people forget just how good he was. And as a receiver, that's the thing, was a much better receiver than Adrian Peterson. Although obviously Tomlinson was a very good receiver also. So, we only had room for a couple of running back. We didn't have room for Marshall Faulk because a couple of his best years are in the 90s. And we talked about Edgar and James, and we talked about LaShawn McCoy. But we ended up going with Priest Holmes as our top guy, and then Christian McCaffrey, who's been phenomenal, and then Derrick Henry, because we wanted to have at least one guy who would be the guy you'd give the ball on 3rd and 1, and there's nobody better at breaking tackles and getting yards after contact than Derrick Henry.
Well, don't call him names on the internet unless you're going to call him Aaron Schatz. Thank you, Aaron, for your time. And go check out the NFL All Quarter Century team, the best 53-man roster and coaches at ESPN.com. Aaron, thank you so much for your time.